you hear me? Okay. Good evening. Thank you all for coming this evening. Before we get started, we just wanted to, Evanston Public Library has recently, we have our land acknowledgement. So before colonization and settlement by people of European descent, the place we know as Evanston was home to the Potawatomi, Odawa, and Ojibwe tribes, also known as the Council of the Three Fires. It also served as an important crossroads and meeting place for a number of other indigenous tribal nations, including the Ho-Chunk, Illinois, Anoka, Kickapoo, Miami, Menominee, Peoria, and Sac and Fox nations. We acknowledge and honor the original people of this land, as well as the indigenous people that still call this area home, and support their continued work for justice, self-determination, and sovereignty. In so doing, we honor indigenous protocol and remind ourselves and our community that land acknowledgements do not exist in the past tense. And so for this evening, we thank you all for coming out for our very own Evanston Will Linder for his book, co-authored A Scientific Revolution. Will Linder is an Evanston-based author and editor. He's a graduate of Johns Hopkins University's Krieger School of Arts and Sciences, where he majored in history. In addition, he holds master's degree in business administration and liberal arts from the University of Chicago. Will has had a long career in business, academic, and journalistic writing. He is also, just so you know, a huge Blue Jays lacrosse fan. We will have Will's books available afterwards for sale. And so we look forward. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, Mr. Will Linder.
I'm going to take a minute to get the view up that I'm more accustomed to. You know, Tyler, I escaped my my presenter view here, so.
I think you're in presenter.
Yeah, but I don't see. Oh, there we go. I gotcha. Thank you. Okay. Great. Thanks for that introduction, Bridget. Welcome everyone, and thanks for coming out this evening. I'm going to talk about a book that I wrote with my good friend and fellow Hopkins alum, Dr. Ralph Ruben. You can call me a late bloomer. I was a history major in college. I spent my career here in Chicago in marketing for the past 30 plus years, but I didn't get around to writing a book, at least not a history book, until I was 71. So I'm not sure what that tells you about dreams deferred, but this was a sort of dream deferred. Our book is about a revolution that transformed medicine from a rough and ready, saw as fast as you can kind of trade into a scientific profession. We tell the story through the lives of 10 men and women who literally gave body and soul to advance research, medical education, and patient care. I'll start with a couple of disclaimers. William Osler, one of our 10 figures who was perhaps North America's most famous physician, warned about the perils of biography with these words. He said, "What more delightful in literature than biography? And yet how uncertain and treacherous is the account which any man can give of another's life." To Osler's caution, I'd add one more, and that is that neither Ralph, my co-author, nor I are trained as professional historians, though we both share a passion for the subject. Even so, I'd like to spend the next 25 minutes or so giving you an overview of our book, and then leave some time at the end for questions. With the downsides and challenges I mentioned, why take on the challenge of writing about a pivotal period in medical history? Well, another one of our heroes or role models, William Welch, who was the first dean of Hopkins Medical School, answered that question with these words. He said, "I think there has never been a time where the past has had more wisdom to give. We should not go bluntly against all of the teaching of human experience." Welch's faith in history is as true in the age of COVID as it was a century ago. By the way, Welch's era had its own global pandemic, the Great Influenza of 1918. Welch played a key role in combating that pandemic using, guess what? Techniques like social distancing, masking, that are now very familiar to us. To understand the history of medicine, to understand why the history of medicine can teach us important lessons, we need to look backwards to the late 19th century. In 1869, Harvard President Charles Eliot proposed written exams for medical students. You can see how one of his professors, the surgeon Henry Bigelow, responded. Bigelow knew that Harvard medical students were barely literate. They would never be able to pass written exams. This slide paints a dismal picture of medical schools in the 19th and early 20th centuries. You can see entry requirements were uniformly low. The famous Flexner report, published by the Carnegie Foundation in 1910, summed it up best. The report noted that, quote, medical schools were filled with students too stupid for the bar and too immoral for the pulpit. Probably more alarming was the fact that most medical students graduated without ever examining a patient. He wasn't an American, but this painting of the British surgeon Robert Liston epitomized surgery in the years before the introduction of general anesthesia. Liston was famous in an era where speed was everything. He once amputated the leg of a patient and accidentally cut off the fingers of his assistant. Both died of infection. A spectator was apparently nicked by Liston's waving scalpel, went into shock, and also died. That's a 300% mortality rate from one operation. I suspect Donald would have to resign or leave a hospital that had those kinds of surgeries. But by the end of the 19th century, one medical school was different, thanks to the vision and grit of a woman we will meet shortly. You can see its entry requirements and approach to training physicians here. By applying science to medicine, it forever transformed medicine in America. That medical school was Johns Hopkins. Our book, A Scientific Revolution, is about this inflection point in the history of American medicine. It focuses on 10 men and women who drove this change. I'll start with our first, then move directly to our last, and if time permits, briefly touch on a couple of our other role models. Our first transformative figure, Mary Elizabeth Garrett, wasn't a physician at all. Many people who know Garrett's story believe that the medical school at Hopkins should really be called the Mary Elizabeth Garrett School of Medicine. Garrett was an ardent proponent of women's rights, especially their right to an education. But in her own aspirations were thwarted. Her brothers attended Princeton, but despite Garrett's fervent desire for a college education, her father would not permit it. Daniel Gilman, president of the newly opened Johns Hopkins, supported her father's view and denied Garrett admission. Gilman believed that women should be protected from the crude behavior prevalent among male undergraduates. Of course, none of us have ever heard of males on campus behaving like that. Instead, Garrett settled into the role of being Papa's secretary. She traveled with her father, John Garrett, president of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, and became an expert on the company's business. As his health failed, she took over many of his responsibilities. John Garrett died in 1884. Mary Elizabeth Garrett inherited a third of one of the largest fortunes of its day. But what was more remarkable was what she did with that wealth. She was determined that women should, quote, rise above the dull commonplace of their lives. Her first step was founding the Bryn School for Girls in Baltimore, which is still very much alive and thriving today. At the time it was founded, there were few schools that prepared young women for college. Garrett funded the opening of the school, which was even equipped with a state-of-the-art gymnasium. That's especially ironic because Garrett herself was lame as a child and wore a brace and felt that she was isolated from other young women and a lonely child. But the school did indeed have a state-of-the-art gymnasium. And more importantly, Garrett was determined to ensure that graduates of the Bryn School could meet the highest college entry requirements. Her focus on academic standards, as well as equal opportunities for women, was evident from her earliest days as a philanthropist. Garrett's next venture to promote educational equality was at Johns Hopkins, the same university that had denied her a college education. When Mr. Hopkins died in 1873, his will provided for the establishment of a university, a medical school, and a hospital. But that will also tied the institution to the fortunes of the B&O Railroad, whose shares were never to be sold. By 1888, a falling stock price and reduced dividend had plunged the university into a financial crisis. Gilman was desperate. The hospital was scheduled to open in 1889, but less than $70,000 remained to build the medical school. He put out the call for an additional $100,000 to open the medical school. Garrett was part of the Friday Night, a group of 5 women who shared her commitment to female equality. Here she is in the center of the group. They were the daughters of some of Baltimore's wealthiest citizens. Garrett's close friend is on the left in the black dress. Her name was M. Carey Thomas. The group developed a scheme to solve the medical school funding problem. Integral to that plan was donating the money if, and only if, the trustees would agree to admit women to the medical school on the same terms as men. You can see the plan described in this excerpt from excerpt of a letter from M. Carey Thomas to Mary Elizabeth Garrett. What followed was a prolonged struggle. We don't have time to go into all the back and forth between Gilman and the trustees on the one side and Garrett and the Friday night on the other. Suffice it to say that Gilman and the trustees fought tooth and nail against the women's agenda. In the end, Garrett took matters in her own hands and agreed to donate $306,977, the exact amount sought by the trustees, and not one penny more, but attached 6 unalterable conditions. Here they are. The first and the last stand out. I'll give you a moment to glance at some of the rest. Together, these conditions amounted to a complete revamping of the prevailing for-profit trade school model of training doctors that had long dominated US medical education. Gilman and the trustees continued to resist with, in Thomas's words, quote, a tangle of hatred, malice, and detraction that beggars description. Ultimately, they had no choice and gave in to Garrett's hardball brand of philanthropy. Garrett's vision and tenacity permanently changed the way doctors are trained in the United States. Here you see my co-author, Ralph. Here you see the Hopkins Medical School class of 1900 with 7 women pictured. By contrast, Harvard didn't admit women to the medical school, to its medical school until 1945. This is my co-author, Ralph, at Mary Elizabeth Garrett's gravesite in Greenmount Cemetery near Hopkins Hospital. The inscription reads, a woman of quiet, realized enthusiasms. She served her day and generation and well, and will long be remembered by those for whom she labored. When we think about Mary Elizabeth Garrett, we can't help but remember her commitments to equity and to excellence. In that light, it's hard to disagree with those who have said that the medical school at Hopkins should rightly have been named in her honor. Let's fast forward to our last transformative figure, Vivian Thomas. Vivian is the only person in our book who is the subject of a Hollywood movie. Something the Lord Made stars the rapper Mos Def as Thomas and the late Alan Rickman as the surgeon Alfred Blaylock. In 2004, it won an Emmy for the outstanding made-for-TV movie. Has anyone here by chance seen it? Yeah, pretty good, isn't it? I think so. It takes some liberties with Thomas's biography, but it's true to his spirit, and I would highly recommend it. It's available, I believe, on Amazon or HBO. Thomas's impact on modern cardiac surgery was significant, but you won't find his name in any textbooks or journal articles of the time. So who was he? His grandfather was a slave. He grew up in Nashville, did well in high school, which of course was segregated, and hoped to attend college and eventually medical school at a historically Black institution. Thomas lost that chance when all his savings from work as a skilled carpenter disappeared in a bank failure during the Depression. As a last resort, he took a job as a surgical assistant to Alfred Blaylock, a Vanderbilt University surgeon who was doing pioneering work on shock. And as an aside, Blaylock's work on shock, which was poorly understood at the time, probably resulted in saving thousands of lives of GIs wounded during World War II. For salary purposes, Vivian Thomas was classified, though, as a janitor. Blaylock had trained at Hopkins. When his growing reputation prompted Hopkins to offer him the position of chief of surgery in 1941, Blaylock urged his talented surgical assistant to come with him. There they met the pediatric cardiologist, Helen Tausig. She had observed that so-called blue babies, babies born with a combination of heart defects that caused their lips to turn blue, eventually died of a lack of blood flow to the lungs, not from heart failure. Blaylock charged Thomas with first replicating the blue baby condition in dogs and then surgically correcting it by joining the subclavian artery that supplied blood to the dog's front legs to the pulmonary artery, thus restoring adequate blood flow to the lungs. To perfect this procedure, Thomas, wearing a surgical mask in this photo, operated on hundreds of dogs. This is Anna, the first patient to survive the experimental operation. Her portrait hangs in the medical school among all of the other famous contributors to medical history. But to my knowledge, it is the only portrait with 4 legs and a wet nose. Anna lived on for years at Hopkins, and that delighted hundreds of children who visited the hospital for cardiac procedures. The first human patient to undergo the blue baby operation was Eileen Saxon. When her parents brought her to Hopkins, she was 15 months old, but weighed only 11 pounds. Even drinking from a cup caused her to lose her breath. Her lips were a deep shade of blue. Tausig diagnosed her as having tetralogy of Fallot, a combination of 4 heart defects that resulted in insufficient blood flow to the lungs. Blaylock and Thomas were frank with Eileen's parents about the surgical risks. In the end, everyone agreed that Eileen would die shortly without the operation. When the operation began in November 1944, the head of anesthesiology, Dr. Lamont, refused to participate because he thought the surgery was too risky. Thomas had performed the operation some 200 times on dogs, but due to his schedule as chief of surgery, Blaylock had done this operation just once, and then only as Thomas's assistant. During the operation, Thomas stood looking over Blaylock's shoulder, coaching him at almost every step. We have the original audio recording made during the surgery with snippets like the ones you see here. At one point, Blaylock complains, "Only Vivian is to stand there," meaning directly behind him. At another point, he says, "Now you watch, Vivian, and don't let me put these sutures in wrong." The operation was a technical success and demonstrated that the procedure could be safely performed. Tragically, Eileen's pulmonary insufficiency returned and she died close to her 2nd birthday. Nevertheless, word of the procedure quickly spread around the world. By 1951, more than 1,000 children had undergone the blue baby operation at Hopkins. The mortality rate was only 5%. Where did the title of that award-winning movie about Vivian, Something the Lord Made, come from? It came from Blaylock, who said about one of Thomas's later surgeries in the dog lab, quote, "Well, this looks like something the Lord made." Thomas taught an entire generation of surgeons in the dog laboratory at Hopkins. The respect of his surgical peers did nothing to change the racism Thomas faced throughout his career. Hopkins, like many hospitals at the time, was rigidly segregated. Here you see some of the barriers Thomas faced in an era when water fountains, blood banks, and even morgues were divided into colored and white. Maybe one of the most galling for someone as proud as Thomas was the fact that Blaylock discouraged him from wearing his long white laboratory coat outside the surgery lab for fear that he would be mistaken for a doctor. In a piece of bitter irony, the same residents Thomas taught in his surgical laboratory by day were often guests at the evening parties Blaylock hosted at his home, where Thomas was sometimes hired as a waiter or a bartender. Thomas died of pancreatic cancer in 1985. In 1976, that actually is 4 years after I graduated from the undergraduate school, he was belatedly awarded, Hopkins belatedly awarded him an honorary doctorate. His portrait now hangs opposite Blaylock's, his longtime colleague, and often his nemesis, in the Alfred Blaylock Clinical Science Building. And just in the last few months, the first Vivian Thomas scholarship winners started their PhD studies at Hopkins. The Thomas scholarships are designed to foster opportunities for graduates of historically Black colleges and universities to pursue doctorates in STEM fields at Johns Hopkins. Here you see the original illustrations created for our book by David Reaney, who is a professor of art as applied to medicine at Hopkins. I wish we had time to delve into all 10 of our men and women, but we don't. I want to leave some time for questions and conversation, but maybe I can give you a glimpse of just 2 more of them. Let's look briefly at the life stories of John Shaw Billings near the beginning of this extraordinary period in medical history, and Helen Tausig close to the end. We could just as easily have looked at William Halsted, who revolutionized surgery in America despite a nearly lifelong addiction to cocaine and morphine. Jesse Lazier, who sacrificed his life to prove that the mosquito was the agent of transmission in yellow fever, or Dorothy Reed, whose groundbreaking research identified the cell that causes Hodgkin lymphoma, but who was denied a faculty position because of her sex. Billings began his career as an Army surgeon and took part in the bloody Civil War battles at Chancellorsville and Gettysburg. In one letter to his wife, he described spending an hour getting the operating tent blood out of his hair. In another, he says all he is trying to do is to give his wounded patients a measure of comfort and create, quote, order out of chaos. Those words, order out of chaos, are an apt description of how he spent the rest of his life. As these before and after pictures show, the war took a terrible toll on Billings. He would never again operate or practice medicine. Instead, he used his powerful intellect and superb organizational skills to design and build large projects. Here's a list of just some of Billings' accomplishments. You can see that they run the gamut, from planning the new Johns Hopkins Hospital to organizing the New York Public Library system. One of his most important achievements was compiling the index catalog of the Surgeon General's Library. This massive bibliography covered more than 170,000 books and over 500,000 medical journal articles. It became the cornerstone cornerstone of today's PubMed database that medical researchers worldwide consult to review the scholarly literature about their chosen problems. And then there is Helen Tausig. She was the daughter of a prominent Harvard economist, but lost her mother at an early age and struggled to overcome profound dyslexia. As an adult, she became deaf, almost completely deaf. She listened to the heart. She used her fingertips rather than a stethoscope to feel the rhythm of her patients' heartbeats and diagnose their conditions. She was tough when she needed to be. Early on, the dean of Harvard's public health school told her she could attend classes there, but not earn a degree. I love this. She walked out of his office asking him, "Who is going to be such a fool?" She graduated from Hopkins Medical School in 1927 and became an expert in pediatric cardiology. She observed that some babies born with cardiac defects producing cyanosis or oxygen deficiencies lived longer when an opening in a small artery that shunts blood around the lungs of a fetus and normally closes right after birth failed to close, giving these infants a second chance at having blood flow to their lungs. Towson took this finding to Blaylock and Thomas and challenged them to find a way to, quote, reroute the plumbing, to surgically replicate this arterial pathway. The idea for the Blue Baby operation was Helen Tausig's. Tausig didn't hesitate to make her views known publicly. Late in her career, she learned from one of her former fellows that mothers in Europe who had taken a sedative containing the drug thalidomide were giving birth to babies with only stumps for arms or legs. She flew to Europe and interviewed physicians, government officials, and drug company executives. She concluded that thalidomide was a hazard to pregnant mothers and their unborn children. Tausig returned to the US and sounded the alarm about thalidomide, which was under review by the FDA. She was instrumental not only in blocking the introduction of thalidomide in the US, but also in dramatically tightening the rules governing the approval and experimental use of new drugs. Towards the end of her career, her former fellows commissioned a portrait of Tausig. The painter was a very young Jamie Wyeth of the famous Wyeth family. Here's how he described Tausig's way of sitting for the painting. She would just sit. She would just stare right at me intently with those blue eyes. It was so amazing. I don't think she had a care in the world, least how she looked. When the painting was unveiled, several of her fellows, of Tausig's fellows, burst into tears. They had expected a portrait that captured a woman renowned for her tenderness with her tiny patients. They asked that it never be hung in the halls of Hopkins Hospital. To this day, Wyeth's portrait remains at the Chesney Medical Archives. And that is, in fact, where I saw it for the first time in March of this year. It is like an astonishing painting, but it has never been publicly displayed. But there's no doubt that Wyeth captured an essential aspect of Tausig's personality. Before I close, I want to acknowledge my co-author, Ralph Ruben. Ralph is director of the pathology department at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine and director of the Saul Goldman Pancreatic Research Center. His passion for history and for distilling from the lives of our 10 men and women important lessons for today have made our work together that much more productive. I'm proud to call Ralph a friend. My appreciation also goes to Bridget for inviting me here to the Evanston Public Library, and to the staff that made this possible. That's a treetop level view of our book. Thank you for listening, and I'd welcome your questions. Al.
Identified any other characters that you might want to write about in the field of medicine that are carrying on today?
Yeah, well, there are dozens and dozens, not just at Johns Hopkins, which was a pioneer in scientific medicine, but today scientific medicine is what medicine is. When we go to the doctor, we expect their prescriptions and their treatment to be based on research and evidence. There are literally dozens of figures, and it's fun to speculate. Ralph often speculates on people who should be included. There was a guy, I think his name is Myofsky, who invented the cardiac defibrillator. And he said he would have been a great candidate for number 11 if we had gone that far.
Other names come to mind, like Shaw
Sure,
and others. So I was just curious.
sure. And I mean, there are people in the cancer research field, virtually any specialty in medicine these days has its luminaries, its heroes. What we found interesting was the 10 we picked were not only extraordinary for what they accomplished and what their contributions were to medicine, but because their lives sort of faced immense obstacles and they were able to achieve all of that medically, yet triumph over some pretty tough odds in their lives. Jim. You know, it was part happenstance and part design. I knew Ralph from volunteering as an alum on the Alumni Council, which brings together people from all 10 divisions, 9 divisions of the university, everything from the music school at Peabody to the medical school to the undergraduate arts and science campus. I knew him not awfully well, but we served on this Alumni Council, which has 100-odd people on it. And during the pandemic, Hopkins felt like they were going to lose touch with alumni across the country because all kinds of events that used to take place in Chicago and Atlanta and around the country couldn't go forward. So they started pushing faculty to design content and put it out on what they called Hopkins at Home. And kind of as a lark, I signed up for Ralph's class on, it was called 9 Greats in Hopkins Medicine. And I had been a history major, but I knew nothing about Hopkins medical history or the history of medicine generally. And when I got done with it, I sent him an email and I said, you know, this is great storytelling. It would be a shame to let it sit out there in cyberspace. And we thought, well, maybe there's a pamphlet we could do about this. And one thing led to another, and we dug into it. And after about 12 months of research, we sold it to Pegasus Books in New York City. But so we were fortunate in that respect, but also we leveraged existing capital to make something happen in terms of a book. Yes. Yeah, I don't know that history, but it would be fascinating to look into. I do know that at Hopkins, the first Black student, I believe, entered Hopkins Medical School in probably the mid to early 1960s. And there were very few at the start, but over time, especially by the 70s, there was a significant enrollment by Black medical students at Hopkins. And some of them, the ones I know of, like Levi Watkins, went on to very distinguished careers in cardiology. I don't know a lot about the history of Meharry, and I believe Fisk has a medical school as well. That's an unexplored chapter of history that probably deserves more attention. There was only one woman. And what year was that? Right. I think that was the norm in many medical schools. And indeed, Hopkins admitted its first women to the medical school in the class of 1896, the first graduating class since the school opened in 1893. But still, if you look at that picture, you see maybe 7 women in a class of 28 or 30 people. So women had a tough row to hoe, even at schools that did admit them. Yeah, I mean, I think that we're beginning to find, that my sense of history departments now is that they're refocusing a lot of energy on telling the stories of people of color, which previously had been known maybe in their communities, but not in the general population. I mean, I think what's emblematic of that is the fact that Vivian Thomas's name is not on a single one of the papers that Tausig and Blaylock published about the Blue Baby operation at the start. Yet it was clear that that operation probably wouldn't have been possible without his work. Right. Right. Yeah. Right. The name Alan Toussaint occurs to me, but I don't know whether he was a child psychiatrist. I believe he was an African-American psychiatrist at maybe Harvard, but I mean, there is tons of research that remains to be done for sure. Yes. Right.
There was a position that the FDA was specifically barred to by
I have read, I don't recall that woman's name, but I believe that's exactly right. And Tausig, really, yeah. Yeah, no, it took a certain amount of courage because at that time, the approval process was, drugs were given freely for experimental use, and the FDA had very poor tabs on how they were being used and what the results of trying them on human patients were.
Thousands of Europeans of age 60 now are ruined, but only 17 Americans were affected because a few American tourists actually bought it over the counter in Europe and came home with it without.
Right. My understanding that there were also GIs whose wives were pregnant in Europe and had thalidomide and sedatives prescribed for them. And that was another reason that there were US cases, but you're absolutely right. It was never introduced here or legalized here. Other questions? Yeah. Really? Your comment about thalidomide rings a bell because in our reading about it, it turned out that it was mixed in cough syrups, cold remedies, widely prescribed for morning sickness, as you said. It became, I guess, because it had very little few addictive qualities. It was a German company that originally produced it. They felt that it was very useful in a wide variety of over-the-counter medicines, which obviously led to disaster. So.
Found that it's really just the left-handed enantiomer that the thalidomide prevents the formation of new blood vessels. But I only recently found out that even if the separation but apparently it has some use to
Wow. An unanticipated consequence, I guess. But, Anne. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, it wasn't displayed because it was commissioned. It was paid for by women who had trained under Tausig at Hopkins, who were fellows or graduate students who had studied with her, and they paid for Wyeth to paint it, but they hadn't anticipated that he would do such a painting. When he said that when he first was given the commission, he was shown some pictures of Tausig in like formal dress with a string of pearls, and he said it looked like a suburban woman at a bridge game, at a bridge party. And he sort of felt like he went to Cape Cod, where she had a summer home, and she had grown up in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And he walked the beach and he had long dinners with her in her cottage. And he began to understand that despite her renowned tenderness for children, she was a very intense, driven person. And I guess her fellows weren't expecting that kind of painting at all. They paid for it, so they had a certain amount of sway with the Hopkins administration, and it remains in this. It's not a closet, but it's a room in the archives. And when I saw it, I finally understood what people were talking about its power to sort of capture her intellect and her intensity. But it was because of her students' wishes that it never was hung publicly. So. Well, I don't have any hard facts on that. My impression is that women are now at least 50% of many medical school classes, if not more, and certainly people of color are way above, represented in numbers way above those when minorities were first admitted to medical schools. But it's a changing world. We're probably the better for it, in the sense that I think Mary Elizabeth Garrett understood that excluding half of the world was denying yourself a huge talent bank. She had the foresight to understand that about women at the time. So. Became doc. Yeah, never thought about that, but that makes complete sense. So. Wow, that represents a sea change for sure. So, well, thank you very much for listening. I appreciate it. And